Our next speaker has had a varied and distinguished career in the United Nations, with his current task being commensurate with the magnitude of the theme of our conference. Undersecretary General Fabrizio Hochschild, Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the commemoration of the United Nations 75th anniversary, organized and led the global UN at 50 dialogue on the theme, The Future We Want and the UN We Need. It has given us unique insight into what the public wants at this challenging time for the world and how we can shape our future together. Many of the UN at 75 findings resonate with the themes of the past 2 days, and they will complement and inspire the outcomes of this project. Fabrizio, we're very sorry that you could not travel to Geneva to be at the opening session, but very much appreciate your being with us today from New York. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and it's very good to see you. Thank you for the organizers of this event, and warm greetings to all participants. I really hope everybody is safe and their loved ones too. I'm a little bit grateful that I'm speaking before Jeff Sachs, because I felt very nervous about speaking between Jeff Sachs and Jane Fonda when I don't even have a name that begins with J. So no redeeming qualities against the background of such stars. So I'll be the sort of, the little warm-up band, the plane's off tune before the performance of the stars. By all accounts, our world has been precipitated towards a pivot point by the pandemic. The COVID continues to exact a huge toll on our health systems, on our economies, on our social lives, and on our societies. But it is the most visible of multiple current international crises. Climate change, pollution, destruction of our environment is causing even greater damage both to the planet and to the inhabitants of it. Social inequalities growing worse in 2 out of 3 countries over the past 30 years, rising geopolitical tensions, and the disruption of new technologies are testing the capacities of our institutions. 75 years after the creation of the United Nations, international cooperation is, against this backdrop, arguably more vital than ever. And at the recent General Assembly UN 75 summit, the overwhelming majority of leaders of member states referred to the centrality of the United Nations to address global challenges. And yet, this rhetoric notwithstanding, today, in the words of our Secretary General, we have a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. And it's often the political will for solutions rather than the solutions themselves. We know exactly what the solutions are for climate change. We're just not pursuing them with the ambition and vigor required. We see a retreat from multilateralism with the resurgence of superpower friction and rivalry, a rise in isolationism, ad hoc shifting alliances of fragmented groups of like-minded states, and generally also multilateralism fatigue, a sense it's just grown too difficult to get global agreements. We have to acknowledge that the crisis is also due in part to a growing sense that multilateralism has not delivered and is not delivering. There's grave disenchantment in the Security Council, but there's also broader disappointment on the inability of the membership as a whole to move forward with the urgency required, for example, to counter climate change and species depletion. There is a consensus among member states that we need to rethink the way our global institutions work and infuse them with new energy to overcome this dangerous and threatening paradox between a rise in global challenges and a decline in global cooperation. And it's against that background that my office was tasked by the Secretary General to undertake what he termed a global listening tour, to seek fresh guidance, new inspiration from we the peoples, to help us to overcome the impasse at which we now find ourselves. To that end, this year we organized a series of global conversations on, and the title was set by the General Assembly, The Future We Want, the UN We Need. We reached out to peoples across the world, and especially youth, and asked them 4 questions. What are your largest priorities for post-COVID recovery? What are your priorities for the world 25 years from now? What do you see as the biggest threats to the realization of that vision? And what are your expectations of international cooperation and the UN in particular to address any gap between the world you hope for and the world we might get if current megatrends continue? We got feedback from hundreds of thousands of people through thousands of so-called UN 75 dialogues. We got survey responses from 1.5 million people in all 193 member states. We commissioned 2 renowned independent survey companies, Pew and Edelman, to do scientifically sampled surveys as a reality check in 50 diverse countries. And we also reached out to universities and think tanks and used AI tools to read sentiment across many countries. We synthesized these results and have put out a report. So what are the key findings? First, striking against the backdrop of polarization, friction, disagreement, and deadlock here at the UN, across all regions, ages, and social groups, respondents were remarkably united in their priorities for the future, remarkably united around their fears and their expectations of international cooperation. Amid the COVID crisis, the immediate priority, perhaps unsurprisingly, for most respondents everywhere, is improved access to basic services, affordable healthcare, quality education, safe water and sanitation. Perhaps more surprisingly, the second main priority for people post-COVID is greater solidarity, increased support to those hardest hit by the pandemic. And that includes a demand to better tackle systemic inequality. COVID-19 has drawn public attention to its disproportionate effect on the most vulnerable and to the deep inequalities that characterize our world. There is also a related demand to rebuild not with the same economic models, but with one which is much more inclusive. Looking to the future, the overwhelming concern, and this is everywhere, relates to climate crisis and the destruction of our natural environment. And it's very striking that even while fears around public health threats have inevitably grown against the backdrop of COVID, the number one concern throughout the pandemic for the future remained the destruction of our environment and the climate crisis. Other priorities looking to the future include a demand for greater respect for human rights and human dignity, a better processes for settling conflict and tackling poverty. And then there was a lot of prominence on the need to do more about corruption and to generate employment. With regard to perceptions of international cooperation and the UN, over 87% of respondents believe global cooperation is vital to deal with global challenges. And striking is the finding that the pandemic has made people think that international cooperation is even more urgent. 75 years after its findings, 6 out of 10 respondents stated that they believe the UN has made the world a better place. But looking to the future, an even larger majority believe the UN is essentially to tackling the world's problems. And it's striking that the demand for international cooperation, although higher among all groups, is higher among women than men and higher among youth than older people. But the respondents are not looking for the same, and we'd be very poorly advised to derive complacency from these findings. The views expressed are not uncritical of our current form of international cooperation or of the UN. Respondents want to see a UN that better reflects the stakeholders of the 21st century and not just the power holders of the 1950s. They want to see a UN that innovates more and that is not only more diverse, but also more transparent, more accountable, and more effective. They want to see a UN that is less paralyzed by difference and more inclusive. So the world spoke and we listened, and we believe that now is the time to step up action, as the Secretary General has stressed. We need to show the world that the current state of affairs and the aspects of dysfunctionality of our international system is not a given and can be changed with more vision and a greater sense of responsibility towards future generations. All states on the 21st of September met here in New York, and the heads of state adopted a forward-leaning UN 75 declaration, which pledged to tackle many of these issues. Furthermore, the declaration called upon the Secretary General to come back to them with very concrete proposals on how the UN can be reimagined, reinvigorated, and upgraded to meeting today's and tomorrow's challenges. And that work has now begun based on the inputs we've gathered from across the world. So we are doing our part, but we know change depends and begins with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Not too shabby for a little off-key band. And thank you for all these synthesis. The findings of the UN 75 dialogue will be important reference points for the way forward.